I'm Karen from the Guggenheim Foundation again. Emmanuel, you have not convinced me that regionalism is as successful as you seem to want to portray it in terms of West Africa. What's in it for regional powers? They want stability. They don't want revolutions. They don't want human rights transformations. They want stability. They want the government next door to be fine. They want the government next door to be fine. And regional associations don't seem to pay enough attention to righteous appeals from the grassroots up for changes in those governments. The Niger Delta is a perfect example of where regional associations weren't, ECOWAS was not interested, and the civil society organizations on the ground got very little support from anywhere. And so, explain to me, I think what your presentation needed was just more details. There are some types of violence that are appropriate for regional interventions, but many, many other types of violence which West Africa suffers from that really do need grassroots interventions.
Yeah, just pass it.
Thank you for your comments. Catherine Harrington, Women's Learning Partnership. I'm wondering, in considering the recent history of regional forces taking action, you brought up Liberia and Sierra Leone, in thinking about human security, in the worst case scenario that we're thinking about where ECOWAS and regional actors want to take or need to take action, what is being done by organizations such as your own or others to engage with them to ensure that those forces are respecting the human security of the local populations and so that they're not perpetuating further violence amongst local peaceful actors? Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was one. Hi, Jenny Owen from the GPPAC Foundation. I wanted to go back to Sophie's question on the issue of political space for civil society. What is the general trend across West Africa? Is there a trend of shrinking space, and how does that manifest itself? And as part of that, I was wondering actually how are local civil society groups in Mali positioned at the moment in the current situation? Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who's really desperate to ask a question? No, excellent. All right, so let's ask you to sum up as well. Anything this is your final chance to speak.
First of all, very quickly, let me deal with the civil society in Mali, and my colleague could probably add on to that. Introspectively, I would be the one to admit here that our biggest disappointment is the role civil society up to now have played in Mali. Rather than a clear analysis and articulating of the issues, they were rather polarized. And they started then to take sides in a kind of a competition that appeared to suggest that for some of them, this was the opportunity for space in government. And that for me has been rather unfortunate. And so the key challenge now is to get a civil society platform that is very clear about their role and what they must do today in Mali. And moving on to the first question on regionalism. On the contrary, your perspective is exactly the opposite if you look at the emerging roles that include the leadership roles of regional organizations. If the ECOWAS were basically to support their peers, a lot of the governments that have been removed in the region with a clear endorsement of the region will not have happened. But you are absolutely right in your observations about some of the examples you gave. The weakness is that when the issue is internal and is not yet a threat to the entire region, then ECOWAS as a collective body cannot intervene. I share with you that up to now must change, because to what extent can we say the Niger Delta is not a threat to the whole region? And so ECOWAS cannot intervene in the Niger Delta because it is up to now seen purely as a Nigerian internal matter. But I think it has gone beyond that. If you look at it from the lenses of human rights abuses, exploitation of indigenous people, etc., etc. But if you look at the role of the region, there is no doubt that more and more it's about the application of the principles defined in the revised treaty of 1993, as I mentioned. And there is a benchmark which then allows the leaders to hold one another accountable to their own. And civil society has a role of reminding them to hold themselves accountable. And that's what we saw happening in Cote d'Ivoire. In Guinea, the UN Secretary General's representative, working closely with ECOWAS, is pursuing all the dialogue in which the leaders are being held accountable. And so there is, in my view, a very positive trend about the role of regional organizations, in this particular case, the role of ECOWAS. And finally, the role of civil society organizations, as you put it. In the case of Nigeria, interestingly, an organization like ONEP steps in because we've been leading the process of dialogue on the Jos Plateau, right up to the level of the State Assembly, until the situation deteriorated and we needed to take a pause and to be able to re-engage. But very clearly, ECOWAS sits in not as a convener, but a civil society organization like ONEP and its partners would convene the dialogue, and they come in as observers because of their limited mandate that it is an internal issue. And to that extent, we are playing those roles of convening dialogue, whether it's in communities in northern Ghana, the Jos Plateau, the Niger Delta. The question now is how to expand those spaces and how to be able to change some of the legal regimes so that we can have more participation in terms of how seriously we take those internal threats. Because I agree with you, they are exacerbating factors for the extremism that is beginning to be widespread.
I just wanted to add on what Emmanuel just said about the political space for civil society in the West African context, in particular in Mali. I think West African civil society organizations are in general, at least the ones working on conflict prevention and peace building are in general doing a lot. When you take ONEP and other organizations working in West Africa, they do have a good working relationship with regional economic communities such as ECOWAS, the AU. In fact, you have at the AU, you have now the platform for civil society organizations to engage with the Peace and Security Council through what they call the Livingstone Formula, and you have a similar mechanism within ECOWAS. So in that sense, they're partnering together to move forward the agendas. And as far as Mali is concerned, civil society in Mali is very weak and polarized. Politicized. We've seen it recently in the crisis. When this whole thing was happening, you hear of no civil society organization actually trying to do something because they're mainly funded by political parties. So they don't have credibility within their communities. People don't trust them. They're highly publicly friends with politicians, and so their agendas are driven by political parties. So honestly, for the case of Mali, nothing is happening in that sense.